Very unusually, I'm going to read my lecture. I don't think I've ever done this before in 13 years of being an academic, but it felt like a big occasion, so I wanted to be careful in what I said. And there is no lectern in this room, so I have to stand here slightly awkwardly with my piece of paper held out in front of me with my reading glasses, so I beg your forgiveness before I start. So, welcome to the Ralph Stacey Memorial Lecture, and many thanks to all of you who've managed to get here despite the train strike, and to the vast majority of you who join us online from all parts of the world. I'd like to thank the Dean of the Business School, Damien Ward, for his support in organising this event, to Jordan Parker, who's done a lot of the hard work on my behalf and Patricia's behalf, and to Emma Maloney, who stands at the back there with the camera, and the events team for their support for this event, which allows us to live stream and to make the video available to those of you in different time zones or are otherwise unable to make this time. Thanks, Patricia, from whom we'll be hearing soon, for travelling from France to respond from the unique position of having known Ralph from early on in the development of the perspective of complex responsive processes, and for co-founding the Doctor of Management programme, which still thrives today. So I'm going to speak for about 45 minutes. Patricia is going to respond. Then we'll take Q&A both from the room and from the people online. So I had planned to organise this lecture for earlier in the year, but Ralph's death seemed too close and too raw. A year after his death, it feels more timely to consider the man and his legacy, and it's also around this time that he would have celebrated his 80th birthday. The first part of what I'm going to do is to talk about concerns my experience of Ralph, because I think understanding him, his character and his motivations is key to understanding the ideas he elaborated with others, and which I'll explore later in the talk. So, every once in a while, someone emerges in society who, because of their unique insight, is able to bring people together in a different relation to themselves, to each other, and to the world. Ralph was such a person. He developed with others a perspective, complex responsive process of relating, which is an interdisciplinary weaving of insights from the complexity sciences, pragmatic philosophy, process sociology and group analysis, which has enabled us to describe the world differently with a unique vocabulary. This vocabulary enables us to notice differently, to think and act differently, and has produced an intellectual and experiential legacy lasting more than 20 years, continuing to this day. The two obvious manifestations of Ralph's legacy are the doctoral programme, the Doctor of Management programme, which I've just mentioned, which I now direct in collaboration with my very able colleagues, Emma Crew, Kieran Chowan, who's here tonight, Karen Norman, Nick Sara and Karina Solso-Iverson, and a wider research community organised around our annual conference. The DMAN has been running since 2000, and is an experiential doctorate run psychodynamically, where students take what they're doing at work as their subject and object of study. They're invited to take their experience seriously, and I hope we're about to produce our 76th doctoral student in the coming weeks. Occasions like this lecture, postings on our website, the recent publication of our Complexity and Management Books series, which is a reprise of the book series that was produced by Patricia, Doug and Ralph in the 2000s, including volumes on consultancy, leadership in the public sector this time around, with 2 more in press on power and politics and research method in maybe 18 months or 2 years' time, also bring countless others into contact with the ideas. One of the striking things about reading the tributes on the testimonial site I set up after Ralph died was a number of people who said they never met Ralph and never heard him talk, but also said that reading his work had changed their lives. This is an observation that I share as a graduate of the DMAN programme myself. he changed my life too. This isn't just to do with with participation in organisational life, but for those leaving tributes to Ralph, his work seems to have brought about a profound shift in their understanding of themselves and their engagement in the world more generally. Once you see the world critically and reflexively as fluid, complex, and in constant flux, as one which is radically unpredictable, it's no longer possible to switch off from doing so, even if sometimes you feel that you'd like to make the world more certain. These are universal insights which have radical existential implications and can have a profound effect on one's sense of identity. If I'm to take the complexity perspective seriously developed at the University of Hertfordshire, then I also need to point to the paradoxical and social nature of Ralph's contribution. So first, the paradox of the individual and the social. Yes, he was a uniquely gifted individual and able to bring his fierce intelligence to a number of areas of intellectual discipline, initially to macroeconomic modelling, where he took a particular interest in mathematics, then to strategy and organisational theory, then to psychodynamics and the discipline of group analysis. If one definition of a genius is an ability to contribute prolifically to a number of different disciplines, then Ralph certainly demonstrated this. He excelled analytically and discursively, which allowed him to straddle both the natural and the social sciences in his ideas. But it's also important to note that his individual genius was refracted through his socialisation. As the son of lower middle class parents who grew up at a particular time in South Africa, he emigrated to the UK because he found it impossible to live with apartheid and because he won a scholarship, at a time when it was very uncomfortable to be a white South African living in London, particularly in the heated politics of the LSE, where Ralph took his PhD. He came out as gay relatively late in life after he was married with a family. He left a high-paying job in the financial world to join academia at a time when to be a member of a university faculty meant having a good deal more freedom to experiment than is the case today. It was possible for him to experiment with his teaching about strategy on the MBA, and along with teaching the conventional texts, to get his students to explore what was going on for them at work. He did so because of his own experience of trying to do strategy in a construction firm, John Lang, and in the city. Ralph told a story that when he was chief strategist for a stockbroker and fund manager in the City of London, his job was to brief all the traders at the start of the day about significant financial trends in the markets. Quite soon into the job, he realised he had very little insight into how best to advise them and about what to do. He approached each new day with increasing dread, travelling from home to the office and reading the Financial Times on the Underground for clues about what he might say when he got there. Standing up in front of the traders, his managers and the whole staff team, he found himself stumbling over what he told them. His mouth was dry, his confidence shot. All he was doing was repeating what anybody else could have said if they'd read the same newspapers. He had a deep experience of imposter syndrome. However, he found much greater insight from listening to an older trader who took little interest in financial trends, but treated the whole performance of trading as a game to be studied. Instead of just relying on the Financial Times and the trade press, the trader paid as much close attention to his colleagues and the waves of enthusiasm or pessimism that swept through them. As far as he was concerned, one of the most important clues for discerning what might play out on the trading floor was how the traders responded to each other, amplifying some trends and dampening down others, how stock prices affected traders and how traders affected stock prices. The market was being created and recreated on a minute-by-minute basis through trades and responses to trades, so that it was difficult to identify the beginning and the end, the cause and the effect. This was a profound insight for Ralph, which led to his pedagogic approach of encouraging students to take their experience seriously, both at his teaching at the University of Hertfordshire and on the MBA here, and then on the Doctor of Management programme. It was during his early career as an academic that he became involved in the Tavistock Institute and attended the Leicester Conference, which is, for those of you who don't know, is an annual 2-week experiential learning event which opened him up to the influence of group dynamics. Ever curious and reflective, he paid attention to what the seminal sociologist C. Wright Mills referred to as personal troubles set against structural social issues with which we all have to deal, and tried to make sense of them. So there are some constant themes here of feeling out of place, of belonging but not quite belonging, of going against the grain, of taking these experiences of not quite belonging seriously. These are often the very same questions which bring many of the students to the DMAN and our annual conference, and which inform the ways of working we've developed together. Well, Ralph could dwell in the contradiction of being committed to groups while being quite a shy man, of being a good raconteur while never making himself the hero of his own stories in a self-aggrandizing way, of being a critical management scholar while working in a largely orthodox business school, of setting out radical and groundbreaking ideas or being quite traditional about his views on religion, state and society. Ralph is one of the few people I have known, who had a poster of Her Majesty the Queen on his bedroom as a teenager. It's also important to point out these ideas were developed in the crucible of strong and often conflictual relationships and heated argumentation in the PhD group at the university, in the intense friendships with Doug Griffin and Patricia Shaw, at the Institute of Group Analysis with colleagues, including his supervisor Farad Dalal. The ideas originally led to a clutch of books at the beginning of the 2000s and continued to evolve in the community of inquiry, that is the Doctor of Management programme, the conference, and those other areas of research where people are interested in fluidity, in process, in complexity. The main mode of learning at the DMAN, based on a unique experiential pedagogy, is collaborative group-based learning, which thrives on discussion, debate, exploration, and conflict. So when I say collaboration, sometimes we're collaborating in order to get to the heart of the conflictual relationships that sometimes emerge in any community of inquiry. For me, what Ralph excelled at was taking his experience seriously to the degree that he could make it accessible to everybody else, and through his ability to do so, to help people to find more about themselves and their relation to the world. In articulating what was going on for him, he was able to bring about a collective shift in identity, both for individuals and the group. Unsurprisingly, you can find a description of this social and paradoxical process from one of the thinkers who is central to the perspective still being developed at the University of Hertfordshire, George Herbert Mead, who points out that a genius has a response as an individual to the same social processes as everybody else. What makes them a genius is that in coming back to themselves, their response is uniquely creative and imaginative, and they are capable, as Ralph was, of speaking in a granular way about the patterning of experience from an individual perspective, which evokes something profound and universal at the same time of what it means to be human and to be in relation with others. Ralph's profound ability to take his experience seriously and to turn it inside out for the benefit of others, to be profoundly there while not standing in the way of others locating themselves, is at the heart of the key insights from the perspective of complex responsive processes and informs the method we deploy on the Doctor of Management programme. We encourage students to take their experience seriously, but by doing so, to decenter themselves, to persist in holding the paradox of the I and the we together. I often find myself saying to my supervisees or people I second supervise, now that we've heard about your experience, you have to get yourself out of the way. It's not just about you. So I want to share with you what I consider 4 key radical ideas at the heart of the perspective to illustrate how taking experience seriously is at the heart of the method and is tied to the uniqueness of what Ralph started and what he was able to demonstrate intellectually and experientially. Apologies to those of you who follow the work closely and you know this in some detail. And when I say I'm going to take 4 ideas, that doesn't mean to say that they're the only 4 radical ideas, but I thought I would start with 4. It might be enough to give us material to think and talk about. So just to wind back a bit and repeat what I said at the beginning of the talk, complex responsive processes for relating draws on 4 traditions of thought. The complexity sciences, interpreted by analogy. Pragmatic philosophy, particularly the work of George Herbert Mead and John Dewey. Process sociology, particularly in the work of Norbert Elias, but also Pierre Bourdieu. And group analytic theory. So those are the 4 pillars of thought, if you like. So, starting with complexity, Ralph was one of the pioneers of taking the complexity sciences as a source domain for thinking about our social life and the dynamics of stability and change. There isn't the time to go into this in depth, but some of the characteristics of complexity models, which are computer-based, is that they're informed by non-linear equations. So rather than producing strong predictions, they demonstrate qualitative changes over time. A meteorological model would be a good example of this, which produces forecasts on the basis of probability rather than certainty. And the further you get into the future, the weaker the predictability. So our weather forecasts are now relatively good in the sense that we can predict with relative accuracy over the next week that there's a 60% chance of rain on Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday. But I think even our weather office has stopped predicting in January ice cream summers. As social researchers, though, we're still left with the task of working out what to do with these models, which are, after all, merely programs running on computers. There is a tendency in management, which is an instrumental discipline, to grab any tools going and to press them into service. Ralph was very determined not to do this, but to cleave to what he saw as the radical implications of the complexity sciences and to borrow from philosophy and the social sciences to make them practical for understanding social life. So, in setting out these 4 radical ideas offered by complex responsive process, it is a unique fusion of the natural and social sciences. It offers, first, a radical interpretation of complexity that doesn't suggest that it can be managed or controlled in any way. If it's complex, it's complex. In taking the step away from the computer-based models towards social science, then, it frames the self as radically and thoroughly social and as of selves as interdependent. Thirdly, there is a struggle between the thoroughly social selves who are interdependent over inclusion and exclusion through the negotiation of power, politics, and valuations of the good. And fourthly, there's a radical focusing on experience and the practice of getting things done with one another, rather than abstractions, wholes, and systems. I'm going to cover the first 3 in a bit more depth, say something about practice, but leave the floor to Patricia on that because I know that's something that you wanted to talk about. So let's start with the first one, the radical interpretation of complexity and life, that we cannot control the uncontrollable. There's no God's eye view or unique perspective which can sum up everybody else's perspective, nor can we know for certain how to intervene for the good. I have a background in working in international development and social development, and I think it's a bit of a shocking thing to say to people who are thoroughly and well motivated to act for the good, that although you might be motivated and intend to bring about good, quite often there are unintended consequences which nobody means, but which are far from good for the community in which you're intervening. So complex responsive processes of relating is not unique in cleaving to a similar view. So in organisation studies, you have other traditions of thought, such as critical management studies and process schools, which also cleave to radical uncertainty. But it's perhaps unique among those informed by the complexity sciences. And we at Hertfordshire work with the idea that whatever happens does so as a result of what everyone is doing together, which has the quality of being predictably unpredictable. This includes the leader, manager, consultant or researcher who has a different position from everybody else that they're managing or leading or consulting to, but is nonetheless still part of the same game. The perspective is not anti-management or anti-leadership or anti-consultant, but it does deflate the claims that say leaders or consultants trained in a particular method or being uniquely transformational or charismatic or distributing their leadership or whatever it is that people are talking about have a unique insight into the human condition and that they can stand separate from what's going on. This makes it problematic to claim that you can design organisations or culture or guarantee transformation in a particular way. And even if well motivated, we cannot know that our interventions with others will make things better. Complexity cannot be unleashed or embraced, nor is it necessarily a good thing or a creative thing. It can be the opposite of all of those things, depending on your point of view and at what point in the historical cycle you're making an assessment. There is nowhere to stand to claim that a situation is simple, complicated, complex, or chaotic. Where human beings are concerned, the perspective of complex responsive process of relating assumes that our interactions and the sense we can make of them are always complex, plural, and open to revision. Our experience cannot be hammered into the shape that we already have in mind. Life surprises us, should surprise us, if we want to hang on to what is vital about trying to get things done with other people. If we're not to treat each other as mere instruments to fulfill organisational requirements. We cannot guarantee being innovative in advance. Organisational life is, just as Churchill described history, one damn thing after another, never finished, never still. So Ralph was always clear in his dealing with the complexity sciences that he wanted to keep it radically open and radically ungovernable, not instrumentalized in any way, which of course always leaves groups asking the question, so what do we do? So the second radical insight in the move from the complexity sciences, which are models based on computers, to the social sciences, what are the implications then for human beings? Well, the model that I guess has most informed the thinking about stability and change is complex adaptive systems models, which again exist in various forms. The one, I guess, which is most widely known is the flocking birds, or Boyd's, the Boyd's experiment, where the computer program is populated by many agents, all of whom are following the same instructions. And I think the 3 instructions are: keep at constant speed, head towards the center of your neighboring birds, and keep equidistant from your neighboring birds. And if you give those little bit strings, those instructions, you'll get a flocking pattern. And this is very amenable to consultants and management theorists, because it seems as though there's a position to describe rules for everybody else. In fact, some people have made quite a good living of using the simple rules idea for organizations to create the complexity or creativity that we say that we want. But of course, human beings are diverse. We don't follow simple instructions. And even if we want to, any of you who've managed groups and give people simple instructions and find that as soon as people leave the room, they've misunderstood what you've said, either intentionally or unintentionally. So in making the move away from the models, particularly when they're rule-based, what does this mean for human beings? And who are we as agents then interacting with each other? Well, drawing on pragmatic philosophy, we assume then, from the perspective of complex responsive processes, that we are radically social through and through. We ourselves, because there are other selves. So, we are who we are because of the groups we belong to and the groups we leave. This is not a denial of individuality, but an explanation of how individuality arises. The I and the we are 2 sides of the same coin. I think one of the biggest affronts to what I think of as orthodox management thinking, which assumes a manager can propose and dispose unproblematically, is that we are more formed than forming, more shaped than shaping. We are not rational, cognitive beings cut off from each other and calculating our responses. Rather, we're caught up in the game with others, often unreflectively. Rather than choosing our management or leadership style, it's much more likely that the circumstances we find ourselves in, the group we find ourselves managing or leading, calls out a particular response from us, which we might respond unreflectively before we even realize we've done it. Our sense of self is tied to how others perceive us. We become ourselves through and with others because of the context, time, and because of the way we were formed by groups we were born into. Although we have our unique genetic disposition, we are social through and through and interdependent with others. From a complex responsive processes perspective, I think there are 2 ramifications from the assumption of the thoroughly social self, or at least 2 that I'm going to tell you about tonight, which are different from what one might learn from more orthodox management education. The first is the requirement to develop group-mindedness. The questions uppermost in the mind of the researcher manager, informed by a complexity perspective, are: what does this group require of me now? Who are we, and who do we think we're becoming? Which are 2 questions that Doug Griffin, my supervisor, framed. Notice that although the manager or leader might have a different role, they don't stand outside the group for which they are responsible. Of all the things which students on the D-Man are exposed to, I think they get a profound training in becoming more skillful in noticing themselves in relation to others, of developing group-mindedness. The second is the importance of the reflexive self, the ability to notice oneself in relation to others. I think of this as a kind of decentering of the self, which I was mentioning previously. The ability to dwell in one's own experience, to take one's experience seriously. If one is formed by the social, then to pay attention to one's experience, but then to step out of the way and to be able to generalize from it. Paying attention to our own experience and trying to make sense of it, but calling out our interpretations into question critically to learn to think about how we are thinking and the assumptions that we bring to bear to understand the world. So third, the other radical insight is that the game of games we find ourselves playing in organizations involves negotiating power relationships because we are interdependent, struggles over ideology, and valuations of the good. So going back to the original insight, which Ralph drew from complex adaptive systems, that whatever happens in organizations does so as a result of what everyone is doing together, just as in the complexity models, which are agent-based, whatever pattern emerges, whether it be flocking or more complex behavior, happens as a result of the interaction of all the agents together. Highly social, interdependent selves need each other and struggle over who is to be included and who excluded from the group. This interdependence implies power relationships where power is neither a good thing nor a bad thing, but merely a function of all relating, which may enable and may constrain. It's impossible to get anything done to produce knowledge without power. It's still the case that in most organizations, discussions about power are hard to have. Mostly we're encouraged to leave our politics at the door, to align, to collaborate, and to be our best selves. Complex responsive processes suggest a much more grown-up understanding of power, one which is less naive. It is our need for each other, for recognition, for reward, for cooperation, for respect, which leads to the fluctuating dynamics in organization in which we all participate. The Vice-Chancellor made a joke to one of our graduating students recently in St. Algmund's Cathedral when congratulating her on her doctoral completion, with a thesis which alluded to power struggles in organizations in the title. He asked her, I assume he was joking, was it difficult to find an organization with power struggles going on? So somehow, in orthodox management, it's very difficult to get into those discussions about power and politics and ideology, and yet we all know that's the currency of organizational life. So just as discussions of power are hard to have in organizations, then they're equally difficult to write about. We can't do so without getting into ethics, one of the constant themes of deliberation in the research community on the D-Man. It would be a travesty not to write about the struggle over inclusion and exclusion. At the same time, it has the potential to do harm to those involved. If we accept Hannah Arendt's interpretation of the role of politics in social life, that it's through public exercise and discussion of power that we become visible to each other in our uniqueness, in our plurality, then we have no choice. Because for Arendt, the alternative is violence. So if we can't discuss, if we can't deliberate, if we can't negotiate, what then is the alternative? Often in organizational life, it's a very strong and charismatic invitation to align with the vision or the values or some way of setting aside our differences rather than exploring our differences. So the fourth radical insight, I think, is the focus on experience, on practice, which I've tried to make the case Ralph was uniquely gifted at paying attention to his own experience and making it available to everybody else. Because the focus on practice turns the focus away from abstractions, from wholes and systems and the everyday currency of organizational discussion about what's going on. Instead, we pay attention to human bodies interacting with each other in the here and now, interpreting the past in anticipation of the future. I'm not going to do this in depth because I know Patricia wants to do so in a response to what I say, but it remains a radical approach to organisational research to consider management as a practice rather than a science, and to continue to pay attention to the complex responsive processes of staying in relation. Right to the end of his life, Ralph remained engaged, involved, and curious, and difficult. We invited him to the July residential of the D-Man in July 2021, where we were still getting back to some kind of semblance of normal. So we had some people in a hotel in Crawley, some people in a room in Copenhagen, some people in a room in Tel Aviv, and we were all trying to connect very badly together with inappropriate technology. And he was absolutely delighted and quite chuffed that we were trying to have an experiential meeting online, even to observe some of those uncomfortable silences at the beginning. We found him on great form, still reading about the history of the Catholic Church, in this case, I think it was, still able to participate skillfully in experiential group. And to give you a flavour of what he was like as a person, here's an excerpt from WhatsApp messages that he sent me from his last stay in hospital, where he was never, actually I think he was sent home, but then admitted to hospital very soon afterwards. So he spent most of last summer in Barnet Hospital, where he was on a ward with older people much like himself, but also at the same time so unlike him. So here's what Ralph said to me. Then much of the time, a few patients keep loudly kicking off. Sometimes a kind of hysterical group contagion spreads with a number all trying to leave and the nurses trying to cope with the chaos. As you know, I can't help interfering, so I became a kind of group therapist, talking some down gently and telling others to shut up and stay in bed. Fuchs was right. Put the sick together and they heal themselves. I think the nurses came to regard me as a sick honorary nurse. I've now been transferred to a ward for the less sick, and so it's far saner. In the sick ward, I also experienced what leadership in practice really is. One of the really obstinate old codgers with dementia insisted on getting out of bed on his own, collapsed, struck his head, and suffered a huge heart attack, during which his heart stopped. The nurse immediately gave him CPR, but here within minutes about 6 doctors arrived and the first immediately assumed control in a most impressive way. A consultant arrived a minute later but made no attempt to take control, simply following instructions. But they were all making suggestions at the same time, so leadership was simultaneously individual and group, and no overt appeal to hierarchy, which was nevertheless clearly there. See, the guy's still thinking. It's amazing. A film of that would be far more useful on leadership course than Henry V. Anyway, the old boy came to, shouting, "Get off me, you're the wrong bloke." He continued to be my client, with nurses asking me to deal with him. I felt like throttling the old bugger. Perhaps you can tell I'm in dire need of escape from here. So, a few more back and forth. And he's dealing with this guy with dementia who is assuming he's being banged up in the wrong place, and he phones his wife to call the authorities and get his lawyer involved. And Ralph watches two, I guess they must be guards or support staff, dealing with this guy in a very gentle and humane way, saying that they've made a report and submitted the report to the authorities, and Ralph is still keen to know how this is going to turn out. Even with all this, he commenced his nonsense after a brief interlude of peace. At this point, I demonstrated how well trained I am by completely losing it and telling him to shut up and shouting how stupid and selfish he was. Of course, that didn't help much, but our skillful young nurse brought him down. He was later to refer to her as my granddaughter. He then insisted on coming over to apologise for disturbing me. By this time, I'd managed to recover some capacity for thinking so pompously, and undertook to forgive him and made an act of reparation. Now, this is a fantastic example of what Ralph could do in an experiential group as well, that sometimes he was completely over the top in his dealings with students. But he had the unique capacity to hang on to the experience of losing control and to continue to explore it with people, which made all of us make better sense of it, including whoever it was on the sharp end of Ralph's thinking. He found this puzzling, probably because he was not a Roman Catholic, so I gave him a little lecture on Melanie Klein's cycle of schizoid attacks, followed by depressive guilt, prompting reparation, followed by forgiveness. As his act of reparation, I asked not for 20 Hail Marys, but a promise to stay in his chair until the authorities arrived with conclusions to their investigation. He promised. I forgave him, and I'll simply remind him that he is a man of his words, a man of his word. Such is an ordinary night in Larch Ward in the wilds of Barnet. I'm grateful to Harold Bear, who's a big figure in the group analytic tradition. I'm grateful Harold Bear is no longer my supervisor because he would probably defrock me. Right to the end, then, whether on his allotment getting involved in the politics of who buys fertiliser and who doesn't, and who has the best allotment and who doesn't, or in his last weeks in hospital, Ralph was fully engaged in social life, which intrigued him. He was never so alive as when things were kicking off, and he was quite likely to be the person who kicked them off. He leaves us with a lasting legacy, a body of ideas which we're still developing, a thriving community of inquiry which continues to produce good academic work, which challenges business school orthodoxies, and lasting memories for those who knew and loved him. Ralph, we still miss you.
Am I on? Okay. Thank you, Chris, again. Yeah, for bringing back both the man and the way he thought and the legacy of what he's left. And as Chris said, when we spoke about this, I said that I would like very much to, in the response, to focus on the practice that ran through all the time that I knew him, and to say a little bit about how I remember him meeting this and how it developed over time, and where I think it is still remains such an important focus in our world now. So, and that's this, what we did together before starting this lecture, which was to meet as a group of people who did and didn't know one another in order to spend an hour and a half conversing without a clear sense of purpose, outcome, or shared intention, and to discover what happened. And I think his sense that there was something so important about this began very early for Ralph, because of this sense he had that there was something wrong, that his experience showed him that what people around him talked about together when they talked about what was happening tended to be generalizations and theoretical models which were very far from what he felt was actually going on. And it was wanting to close that gap, to understand why it was there, what was wrong with the theories, and what could do better, that I think took him out of the work he was doing and made him decide he wanted to go back into academia and devote himself to answering that question. And I think that the early experience that he had of going on the Tavistock weekend, it was just a weekend to begin with, was really eye-opening for him. He just loved that time in a large group over the whole weekend without an agenda. And I remember speaking to him after he came back from that. He was incredibly excited. And I mean, because he picks things up so quickly, already after that weekend, he was talking about medium groups and small groups and large groups and buy-on and fight and flight and the lot, you know, he'd got the... But in particular, what had really taken his fancy was the idea that an awful lot of what people thought and how they construed things in organizations was a fantasy, and a particular kind of fantasy, that it was a defense against anxiety. He came back with this idea and he loved it. And what was the anxiety that he now sort of said, yes, this is what everybody's defending against. It's the anxiety that we are not, after all, in control. And I think that insight is what excited for him this understanding that this practice of meeting together in this way that revealed this phenomenon was something that he stayed exploring for the rest of his life. We had lots of arguments at the beginning about the particular theoretical underpinnings of the Tavistock model and its concerns about boundaries and task and role, and he began to want something more fluid than that, and that's why he enrolled on the IGA. He became very interested in the Fuchs's ideas and the notion of a social metrics and the notion that people in interaction with one another could create interdependent change. And this is what he decided that he really wanted to learn himself as a practice, and he was doing that, as Chris said, alongside his academic lecturing and introducing that into the classroom, which was a really radical thing to do in the business school at that time. And especially as his colleagues didn't know what he was doing and his students couldn't really understand why he was doing, and regularly asked him, what's the purpose of this? We're not getting anywhere. You know, it doesn't give us anything. Where are the tools? Where are the... And he kept saying, that's not the point. The point is that you're going to learn to understand and be able to participate in what is really going on when we talk about organizing and doing things together. And this was really what his interest in praxis was all about. And so when we began to create the Doctor of Management program, the sense that this was going to be an absolutely essential aspect of that education, of the nature of inquiry and the nature of research, was to meet every day in that kind of way, using the experience of meeting together. And at that stage we were large, you know, it was a group of 30 plus people meeting together in an open space, and where he had already made the radical move, despite being training in the IGA, in which it's very clear that these spaces are held by a conductor who's highly trained in that role. He said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to hold it together. Clearly, the faculty have a particular kind of position of authority in that space. They, with the students, will hold this space together, which was already a radical thing to do. And he invited his colleagues from the IGA to work with him in that space. So in particular, Will Pennycook came from the IGA and a colleague of hers as well. And we worked as a faculty. And we all had different experience. We weren't all trained in the same way by any means, but we were attempting to sustain that space and discover that it was full of unpredictable events that would arise in the midst of our work together, often uncomfortable, often conflictual, sometimes incredibly illuminating and inspiring, and that we weren't in charge in any way of when these would happen and how they would happen, or the meaning that would continue to unfold from them. And it was working with this experience that I think really fed a lot of his thinking. And it was during that period that he wrote the book that we know as Complex Responsive Processes of Relating. And the experience of that practice of coming together in this open-ended conversation was what he understood was the way that you would experience the thinking that went into complex responsive processes of relating. So that it wasn't by that stage just to do with the nature of the group analytic understanding. It was also feeding the sense that this is how to experience complex responsive processes of relating as they happen live, and find ways to pay attention, to draw attention, to articulate what is going on, to make meaning together of what is going on, and to discover how diverse and constantly shifting that meaning can be. So that, of course, then also led to conflicts, and what I think has also moved forward this mode of thought, which was the disagreements that came up through that. So for people who were trained in the IGA, there was a lot of conflict around some of the sense about some normative sense about what we did and didn't talk about and how, produced more and more conflicts. And that did create a kind of sense in which this notion of exclusion and exclusion, that eventually the IGA, as they went on being very interested and there was a lot of exchange, but both those colleagues left the program. Even though I think Will in particular was extremely influential in Ralph's thinking, because there was a very distinct difference in their sense about how to understand the nature of that space that we were creating. And at that point, Farhad Dalal came in, who himself was had a very interesting and deeply thought through critique of Fuchs's ideas, which again influenced Ralph a lot and helped him in his articulation of complex responsive processes of relating. And then also Donald MacLean came from Scotland and joined the faculty. And I think in this process there was a increasing sense in which, although, and I find this very interesting, although when you talk about this, Chris, you keep very much that this is a group analytic tradition. And I think Ralph, in the period, which is long now, 10 years at least, since I left the program, it seems as though the connection to that tradition is more held as valid, or as my experience was that it was being very much fragmented and opened out in many other ways. And there were lots of very intense discussions about the nature of the body, particularly movement. So very much within the nature of that setting, it's very discursive. It is to do with words and conversation and discussion. And there was a tendency of ideas taken from the IGA that attempts to actually move or displace yourself within that setting was a kind of acting out, a distraction from the communicative activity. So there was a lot of challenge to all that went on during this period about the nature of voice and the nature of word, about bodies in movement or bodies still. Ralph was absolutely determined to say, if we sit there doing nothing but speak then think, we're completely bodies experiencing, which of course we are. But along with that, there came this sense of, and we don't move. And he was very challenged on that because he didn't like moving. He didn't like it. He didn't, whenever we would go anywhere and there would be the slightest invitation to move, to sing, it was like, no, we're not doing that. So I feel like this is the way in which his own personality was woven into what got included and what got excluded from some sense of this communicative activity and what it involved. So I think during this phase it was very turbulent. There was also a young woman called Eliat Aram who was qualified in Gestalt, who worked closely with Ralph in Gestalt activity, and then she now heads up the Tavistock Institute as a director, and she left the program because of having very, very different ideas than Ralph about what constituted good work amongst the students. So these processes of exclusion and exclusion went on and formed the body of thought that is most closely associated, while at the same time giving rise to ripples which I think continue to keep it alive and active, because I think these questions continue to come back throughout the years. So I don't think they were ever completely removed, but it went through, in real life, a living out of these kinds of processes. And certainly I myself left the program at the point at which Ralph and I were really struggling over this question of the body and the place of the body in communicative activity. And we could not agree on it. But we carried on talking for the rest of his life. I saw him less in the last few years. But I feel that the experience of being involved in that discursive setting and exploring what it meant to be in an experiential group and explore what really happens between us is the most vital thing that I took from those years, and continues to be essential, I think, to all forms of practice. I currently, although I'm supposedly retired, I'm still working, and I'm noticing that wherever I go in organizational life, I'm increasingly faced with people producing very strict ideologies around racism, privilege, post-colonialism, post-humanism, gender fluidity, and all of which I think are fascinatingly important things that we're exploring, and yet wanting to explore them through rigid, rule-based ways of operating. And I think the exact antidote to that is what we were exploring before this, and I think a number of people have said he knew Arendt's work. I don't think he really was as excited about it as I would be, and some of his other colleagues maybe would be, because I think that that tradition that takes that notion away from the notion of purely group analysis and sees it as the public realm that we need to learn to inhabit together as a plural space in which we can be uniquely individual only because we're a we, as Chris was saying, that is interdependent of one another, and that it is only in occupying that space and learning to sustain it and creating the power to open it and keep it open, that is what renders the possibility of a plural political world. So for me, Ralph's work has fundamentally underpinned attempt to produce ideas and a practice which constantly supports returning to that place. And it seems to me as, if not as significant now, if not more significant than it ever was. So indeed, we miss him. I miss him, and I'm glad to have had the chance to come here and remember him, and to also acknowledge the many people who worked with him and who thoroughly permeated his thinking. Thank you.
So, questions from the room and questions from the ether as well.
What's next?
Drinks and nibbles.
That's not what I meant.
What's next is whatever happens as a result of continuing the evolution of the ideas. So the ideas have shifted. So one of the things I was saying in the experiential group is there's something about the ideas which are generous, capacious might be another word, universal might be another word, that has attracted people from all disciplines and none. So people turn up at the conference sometimes saying, I was really interested in complex responsive processes, I read it, and I'm writing the same thing as you're writing, and I read what they're writing, and it's nothing to do with what we're saying. So there's something universal and generalizable about the body of work called complex responsive processes, which speaks to important issues of staying in relation politically and ethically. But nonetheless, you could say, in a way, is so universal that everybody can see something in it, which has an advantage. But the colleagues who are now part of the tradition, who are still contributing, the students, the faculty, people turn up at the conference, so the books that we've produced just recently don't just include DMAN graduates, they include other people who've taken interest in complexity, so we're trying to diversify. And I think questions of political economy have started to emerge in the last 10 years, for example. So you would be forgiven for not knowing what Ralph thought until his retirement speech. I mean, obviously, privately, in the bar, he would say what he thought about the way society was changing or what it was like to be at the university, but in his writing, he didn't deal with it as political economy, even though he was an economist. So I would say one difference already in the last 10 years has been the introduction of more theories of political economy, that we live in a particular time, in a particular society at a particular time where certain values and ideas are held strongly. So how does that affect us in the workplace? How does that affect our sense of self? So I think I would say that complex responsive processes has already changed and is already in the process of change because of the people who contribute to it. Does that answer your question? Patricia, did you want to respond to that?
Well, I mean, it would be great to hear where you think it could go next. I mean, I think that he wasn't very interested in ecological issues, big politics issues. He would always like, and I feel like I think we have to address those things, and I think it has some the very important thing that says you can't predict what's for the good. I think trying to work out how, as a political economy and ecologically, we actually respond to that challenge is where we need to think. And you?
Well, I'm intrigued by what I know of the work. I met Ralph Stacey when I did the DBA here at Hertfordshire University. He came to contribute to that doctoral programme as a speaker. But I'm part of this orthodoxy that you referred to. I teach on the MBA programme and others. And only today I was battering our students with various frameworks and concepts and theories that we expect them to reproduce on assignment. But I've also included this lecture. I'm going to put the link on the module to try and create some sort of debate that we can incorporate. The sort of questions that were rising in my mind was if this central thesis about complex adaptive processes is what you're talking about. What's the antithesis? What is it? Is it just works? Frameworks, endless 2x2 matrices to try and explain the world. You've just got to stay in the question, I suppose, and encourage people to debate.
I mean, complex responsive processes is not the only perspective that deals alternatively. So as I said and mentioned in my talk, there's the diverse critical management school. There's something calling itself process organisation studies, who draw on very much the same philosophers we do, and some even more process orientated philosophers. And you think that actually a process is all there is. There are no human beings involved. There's just this thing called process going on. So there isn't just orthodoxy and complex responsive processes. There's orthodoxy and a variety of schools of thought of which we're one. And even with the people who draw on the complexity sciences, there are people who take up complexity differently from us. So it's very plural in organisational theory. And I would imagine, even if you think of yourself as an orthodox management scholar, even within that there's diversity, isn't there? Some is more critical than others.
Chris, there's a related comment in the chat, and also for people on the online, if you could repeat the question before you speak, that's helpful for them to be able to know what we're talking about. And the comment is that Ralph was also interested in the natural science of complexity, so Prigogine and people like that, rather than just complex adaptive systems and the computer modelling, which also take radical uncertainty and complexity, radical uncertainty seriously. So I wondered if you wanted to add something about that.
He did, and in the textbook.
Could you repeat the question?
Yes. So the question is the fact that Ralph was interested in other natural science scholars who develop theories around complexity, including Prigogine. And that's right. And Prigogine himself lifted off from natural science into philosophy too. And his last books were very much philosophical questions about, can we ever know the nature of reality? About the nature of complexity. And in the textbook that well, actually it's his textbook that I wrote a little bit of. Although it says Stacey and Mowles, it's mostly Stacey with a little bit of Mowles. And in writing it, certainly for the first 50% of the book, I felt embarrassed just changing I to we all the time. We think this, and actually it was Ralph that thought it. And since it was Stacey and Mowles, I had to put we in there. The last third of the book, there's quite a lot of me in there, but if you read that textbook, you can see how he sees the development of the complexity sciences as having implications for thinking about the social. So Prigogine was doing chemical experiments where you have to apply heat to the experiment in order to get the change that we're talking about, this stable instability, this predictable unpredictability. So each of the complexity sciences, in a way, has their limitations the moment you want to make the step towards understanding social life. And that's why he was very clear that he was arguing by analogy. You can't simply pick it up and apply it to social life as if it's the same thing. You can't. And actually, increasingly, although we kept inviting him to do the complexity talk every 18 months or so, he'd do it for new students. Even he didn't talk much about complexity towards the end of his academic life. It was a source domain for thinking differently about stability and change and how change happens.
He met Peter Allen, who was one of the big modelers of complexity in the natural sciences and was doing lots of work for the government on trying to produce very sophisticated complexity-based models of the fishing industry, for example. And I remember that they met and were giving a talk together, and you could see the point at which they truly met was when Peter Allen said, but the trouble is, when I tell the people from the government who come to visit and look at my models and they want to know how they can use them in order to predictively think about policy. And Peter, he said, I say to them, no, you don't understand. They can't, they won't, they don't. All they can do is perhaps teach you to have the flexibility of mind to actually understand the kinds of processes by which unpredictable futures emerge. And I feel like that was the closest that a natural scientist and Ralph sort of got to seeing how that's where you get to.
Peter Allen was a student of Prigogine's. Yes. There's a very good book by Peter Allen, Jean Bolton, and one other scholar from Cranfield, published in 2016, I think it's called Embracing Complexity, where it has a very thorough and detailed analysis of the different complexity models and what they tell you and what they don't tell you. And in a sense, the ones that are more applicable to policy making have a lot of the assumptions taken away. So they're very simplified models. So the more complex it is, the more the model
The less useful they become instrumentally.
because they take on a life of their own.
Exactly, exactly.
And they don't, the more complex the model, the more it loses contact with the world that you're modelling. Any other questions?
A question about Ralph.
Mm-hmm.
So you described at one point as being difficult, or on occasion difficult. How, if at all, did Ralph's character or personality change as a result of participating in these spaces over time?
I first met him in 2003, I think, where I came. So how did Ralph's character change over time as a result of being part of the same processes that we're talking about? And I would say, I think that sitting in a group over a long period of time changes everybody who does it. I would make that strong a claim about it. So everybody changes if you sit in a group systematically. So the idea of Fuchs's idea is that you see yourself reflected back in a hall of mirrors, and that can't help but change you. I first met him in 2003, where he was having exactly the discussion that you alluded to. One of our colleagues said something about, I need to get up and move because I feel like I'm too much in my head. And he exploded immediately and said, well, last time I looked, my head was part of my body. So that dynamic was very much key to that. So I suppose from those early days of seeing him in his grandeur at the beginning of, must have been cohort 1 or 2 of the programme, where he was very much a strong and forceful figure. I saw him, so he was already 60-something when I met him, and he finally retired when he was 75. So I saw him in the mellow years, if you like, and I think Patricia has more exposure to him in the less
I think he did mellow, but it's hard to know, isn't it? Is that we all mellow maybe with age? Not everybody. Some people get more cantankerous. I think he did mellow. But he remained obdurate on certain points to the end. So, yes and no. He softened, but there were some edges that never softened. Some things he held very, very strongly, perhaps like he had a few very, very strong values that never changed.
Got a question from colleagues online, which is, what's the best way to engage with this community as a researcher far from Hertfordshire and far from management studies?
So what's the best way to engage with the community far
to the
from
conference.
Hertfordshire and far from management studies? If you could come to the annual conference, that would be a thing. You could look at the blogs that we produce. You could buy the books. We're starting some new initiatives at Roffey Park in the Horsham, where we hope to have some weekends, sort of not exactly taster weekends, but short weekends based on experiential learning around a theme. We're hoping that the first theme might be on education. So it's still UK based a bit, but if you wanted to get stuff, if you wanted to get an invitation for colleagues from faculty to go and visit, I'm sure that would be an option as well. We can bring complex responsive processes to you. Other questions?
How you've seen these ideas being taken up much more broadly, and whether you've seen things shifting over the time. As you described, Patricia, when you started, I think I read your book when I did my master's in 2008, I think. Now the language idea is much more.
I do think over this period of 20 or so years. I mean, certainly in the field of working with organisations, you can see the shift from a more representative diagnostic view to the notion that of a dialogical perspective. So I think that shift over the 20 years has become quite widespread. It may be understood in different ways, the practice may be very different, but that's a big change that has taken place, I think, so that's a very widely acceptable position that fundamentally organisations are dialogical phenomena, and working in them, you need to understand your participation in that. I think that has become widespread.
It's also the case, so it's never just one thing, is it? It's also the case in many organisations, instrumental ways of managing have become much more dominant. So
yes, at the same time.
Taking my own institution, metrics and performance targets and other ways of setting targets for things are universal, aren't they? And are probably, so the volume that we're bringing out on the public sector, I think 4 of the 8 chapters are on best practice models, performance targets, KPIs, metrics. It's completely dominant. Oh, and we're discussive and we're dialogic at the same time. So it's never just one thing.
So 2 questions, and I'll ask you both of them so that you can choose how you want to answer. So the first one is from a colleague in the US who says, here in the US we remain in the clutches of the leadership industry. Ralph seemed to lose his concern about the distinction between leadership and management. Could you comment on that? And the second question is, what did you find most surprising about Ralph? They may be related answers.
So did Ralph lose the distinction between leadership and management? And the second one was, what's the most surprising thing about Ralph? Do you want to go first?
The most surprising thing about Ralph is that he could occasionally be unforgiving. That was for me the most surprising thing. What was the other question? Clearly the other one.
Did he lose the distinction?
Did he lose the
leadership?
distinction?
I don't think he ever accepted the distinction.
I was going to say he
between
wasn't
leadership
really
and
interested in that. He was not ever part of the leadership industry. He didn't see himself as developing leaders. He always thought that the work of governing in organizations was something that you had to undertake to find authority with others in a dynamic of leading and following that was always precarious. And that's what he was interested in.
So if you think of leadership as a group in improvisation, the narrative that I read you about Ralph in hospital, I think, would typify exactly how we would think about it. Of course, we have people in organisations we call leaders, increasingly these days. I mean, everybody is a leader. I've even seen articles which assume in the NHS that patients could be leaders as well. So you could think that leadership as a concept is so ubiquitous, it's completely meaningless, and it's completely overinflated. Ralph wasn't at all interested in that kind of one theory, one fad after another fad. He was very interested in the exercise of authority in organisations and in groups. You can call that leadership if you like, but is every exercise of authority in organisations about leadership? He would probably have said, no, it's not.
And what he was interested in is that authority is, I mean, it's the dynamic between people. Nobody has authority on their own. And therefore, he was always interested in this interplay. And that authority could at any moment be lost.
There's one more question, which I missed, sorry, which is, I think it's a response to what you said, Patricia. about his values that didn't change. So the question is, which are the values that didn't change, if we're happy to say?
Oh, that's a tough... I have to think a minute. I think he had some deeply ingrained sense of the appropriateness of certain hierarchies of experience and recognized status that needed to be respected, and when they weren't, in his eyes, it was the only time that I would say I saw him unable to sustain the relationship. If he was challenged in a certain kind of way that questioned his experience, his then he could cut. And I felt it was something to do with a sense of respect due, of a very ancient kind of tradition of apprentice to master, of the younger to the older, not in a trivial manner, but he held on to that quite strongly. And I think when he saw that challenged, something would... It's my perspective. I mean, I'm certainly not saying I'm right about that.
Patricia, do you want to add anything?
Surprising. What was surprising about
What was
Ralph?
surprising, or how did you see him say the same over the years?
Ralph always surprised me in his ability to change his mind. So I was talking...
Except.
Yeah. We were talking in the experiential group about... I got into a discussion with him one evening about nationalism and Scottish nationalism. He was dead against it. He thought it was a form of fascism, and he'd seen nationalism in South Africa and he didn't want any part of it, and it was nonsense. And I was trying to make the case that from a Scottish perspective, if the majority of voters in Scotland vote progressively, but they seem stuck with a very, what they would consider right-wing Tory government for years and years and years and being managed at a distance, why wouldn't they want to be independent? I'm not saying I agree with it, but I can certainly see it from a Scottish perspective. He was completely adamant that there's no way that nationalism could ever be progressive. 6 months later, he was arguing the opposite. And that was both surprising and sometimes infuriating, that we'd spent all that time being battered about how nationalism is a form of fascism, but actually he was open to the idea that from a Scottish point of view, in this case, it might be different. One thing that never changed for him, I would say, was his valuation of the quality of the work that was represented in the D-Man community. So the things that upset him the most were if he thought that somebody was going to get the possibility of a doctorate who he thought didn't deserve it.
Mm.
And that led to conflicts between faculty about, so who decides on that? But there was such a strong identification with the quality of work and what we were doing on the DMAD programme.
I think that's very interesting, Chris, because it sort of relates, it sort of fleshes out what I said, because it's related to it. It was like this strong sense of that there is a hierarchy of what needs to be respected, and it's unforgivable not to respect it. And it was very, the conflicts around that would be quite deep.
Relationship threatening.
Relationship threatening, yes.
Can I ask a question hinted at one of the questions coming online? Complex responsive processes of relating with a kind of body of work. A management doctorate which doesn't have a huge footprint in terms of publishing, but which probably has quite significant impact that's unseen in people's work. Ralph be happy with that?
Yeah. He stopped writing journal articles. I don't think the last one he wrote was in 1998, apart from a couple for the group analysis journal. So he never wanted to play that game. And none of us on faculty do produce many journal articles for journals which are valued by universities, 3- and 4-star journals. I think this isn't an excuse, but I think it's widely accepted that the kind of experiential work we do is much harder to write about for 3- and 4-star journals. But you can get published if you want to, if you put the effort into it. But I suppose we don't see that as our audience. Rather, it's researcher managers who are trying to get things done with other people who want to take their experience seriously. So I would guess that the books that we write are read more by more people than any journal article is read, unless it's one of those very famous one that's groundbreaking. So it's a question of where you spend your time and what you can get away with, I guess, in today's institutions. So it's not that we're not productive, we are quite productive in terms of book publishing. Thanks very much.
I gave my
Patricia.
apologies at the beginning.
Yep.
Have a nice drink and chat. Oh, yes. I told her she'd have to stop me walking out with this.
It may be that there aren't very many more questions anyway, but let's stay at least another 5 minutes just to see if there are. So we might stop at 7:30 anyway, Patricia, so you may not have missed us. Thank you so much for making all the effort to come here. Yeah. Yeah. Anybody else for anything else, online or otherwise?
So there was one question online, but I feel like we're out of time because it's more to what Patricia was talking about, but you might be able to have a review, Chris. So organising this conversation is mostly referred to as Patricia Shaw's work. What was Ralph's personal thoughts in the development in that area in the end? Hard for you to answer maybe, now that Patricia's got them.
So I do remember that the discussion was around if you're drawing on analogies from the complexity sciences, particularly complex adaptive systems models, and the evolutionary models, not the ones where all the agents are the same, but where the agents are different and they're doing different things, what is it that changes? So if you're going to take the analogy from the domain of the natural sciences and move it to the social life, what is it that changes? Well, Patricia's insight was that conversation changes. But I think we have developed that further to say that identity changes. It's not just conversation, but identity as well. But it was a unique and original insight that it's not so much the bodies that change. It's the conversation, ways of talking, and therefore ways of thinking, and therefore ways of acting. So if you take the pragmatic position that there's no separation between talking, thinking, and acting, they're all phases of action. So to talk differently means to think differently, means to act differently. So it is a seminal insight, if you like. But all of those different forms of action that change our identities and our understanding of ourselves, of each other. Allora, have we got to the end? Because this isn't an experiential group, we can stop when we want to. Great, thank you very much for turning out. There is drinks and nibbles, I'm not quite sure where it is, but do stay and chat. Thank you very much, online people, for turning up, if you've turned up. If you haven't turned up, you'll be seeing this video posted online at some date in the near future. Thank you very much, Emma, for hosting at the back. And that's it. Thank you.